Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 12 today, and we'll try to complete this long chapter of Samuel's speech, taking up in verse 14. As you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following through this section in 1 Samuel 11 to 15, where Samuel and Saul sort of hash it out directly and indirectly about the question of monarchy. If you haven't watched the introductory video and you're not familiar with this section, I really encourage you to do that before you look at the individual videos about particular sections. In our previous two videos, we first saw how Samuel sought and successfully achieved justifying himself in the eyes of the people as someone who has not acted as a king or acted like God. And then yesterday in our last video, in the second section, we saw how Samuel justified Yahweh's behavior in treating the Israelites with justice over the period before they asked for a king. Today we're going to see how he turns on them and accuses them of rebellion and a number of things, and gives them contradictory expressions of what they need to do in order to be right with Yahweh. And one of the things we need to be paying attention to here, as well as what continues in the next couple chapters, where it's more specifically about Saul. Here it's about monarchy in general, but it'll become much more about Saul in chapters 13 to 15. But we also need to be keeping in mind what we've seen since chapter 8, since the first request for a king, is that at least in Samuel's mind and voice, there are utterly inconsistent outcomes of what is to happen here. And we saw that a little bit with Ian Wilson's take on history and memory, on how no matter how we understand the sources, it ends up with monarchy. Whether that was pro-Saul and anti-Saul, or pro-David and anti-David, or pro-monarchy and anti-monarchy for that matter. But here, Samuel will say that the people have done evil by asking for a king, but then allows them to have a king. One might expect in most situations where one is accused of evil, whether that's the Israelites violating the covenant by one of the prophets, the response is to stop doing that evil and turn around and return to the covenant. So one might expect that the answer here would be, if asking for a king was a sin, to not have a king. And as we already saw in chapter 11, since Saul worked perfectly well as a judge, they could affirm him as a judge and not have him as a king, and all would be well. But instead they end up with the worst of both worlds. They end up with the king that is supposed to be sin, and yet they have to be obedient to God somehow with the king, which is the presence of sin. So it's a very difficult situation they're in. No wonder they end up in exile, but it takes a few hundred years to get there. So let's look at a couple of things that give us an expression of the big picture here. We've been following through this outline of his speech, and we looked at this first part 2 videos ago and this part last video, and now we're going to look at this long section here, and it goes on and on. Samuel just goes on and on in this speech, and although it's quote only 12 verses in terms of how we count them in our verses, for biblical speech it's very long, especially in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. It's a long speech. Let's look at it as a whole and notice something about it. So here's the New Revised Standard. The only translation changes I've made was to take the various English translations of the verb asa in Hebrew and render them all as made. I'll show you the made chart that we've looked at before in this chapter in a moment. And also the word that ra, that's translated sometimes as evil and sometimes as wicked, I've made those consistent. So what I want to highlight here is when we've been looking at this first part, it was just simply Samuel talking about himself, and we didn't see many of these key words. We saw king up there and we saw make here. But notice now, in his recitation of what Yahweh had done, the ancestors cried out to Yahweh, they have sinned and done the wrong service, served the Baals and Astartes, but then turned to serve you. And now that we're in the section starting here, in verse 14, where if you will fear Yahweh your God, Samuel's starting now, we notice how the language changes. We see how much more the question of service comes up, how much more the question of fear comes up in the yellow, and now the question of evil in the red here. And what we're going to see also is a contradiction, because a number of contradictions, but one of them is this: if you will fear Yahweh and serve him, and we see that again, and we see in the end only fear Yahweh, but we also see do not be afraid. So what is it? Are they to be afraid or not to be afraid? And we don't have to get into the question of the Hebrew word for fear can also be translated as revere or have a sense of awe. Those are closely related, as Rudolf Otto, the great phenomenologist of religion, wrote so long ago, that sense of standing in the presence of a force greater than oneself, whether that's God or somebody, a culture raises up, or a great warrior, or something else like that, leads to the same combination of a sense of awe that could also be described as fear. But are you to have it or not have it? Because here you're to have it, and here you're to have it, and here you're not to have it. So again, part of Samuel's, perhaps internal for him, but also at least in his speech, the speech is internally incoherent in many ways about how the people are to understand their relationship with Yahweh and the relationship with their king. So let's look at the verses as we go, and we'll see. So go to another chart immediately, because Samuel introduces a word that's going to be key, a Deuteronomistic word that we'll see in a second. So as Brueggemann points out in my note below, and Brueggemann lays it out in a straightforward way so we can see it just simply in terms of the verbs: fear, serve, listen or heed, don't rebel, and follow. Although the word for follow is not technically there. We'll look at that in a second. So 5 verbs, 4 positive and 1 negative. But notice in verse 15, it doesn't match exactly. If you will not hear or listen and not rebel, but do rebel. So it brings up the hearing and the rebel, but it leaves off the serve, and it returns it to you here rather than you and your king. Because here in the translation we have an issue here. The Masoretic text has your fathers, not you and your king. The Septuagint has your king, and the NRSV combines them by having you and your king, even though none of the text actually follows that. What they're doing is replicating verse 14, where it's you and your king, and assuming that's what's meant here. But it's actually not what it says. So there's another question here about how much the people and the king have to be together in this for their life to be good, or how much it's just about the people independent of the king. So again, among the many confusions that go on here. Serving and fearing Yahweh are common terms, and I won't bring up all the times that serving is named. That ought not to surprise anybody who's ever been to church once, or synagogue for that matter, that serving God is clearly a primary element of what any of these standard religious perspectives is, as well as listening to God's voice. But now rebelling is a separate thing. We have this verb murra here, and it's only here in Samuel, but it's 8 times in Deuteronomy, and it's worth looking at so we can know what exactly rebellion was in the minds of the Deuteronomistic authors, or whether that's the same as in Samuel, the character's mind, is another question. So I've highlighted them here, the ones in Deuteronomy, so we can see what exactly rebellion was. So right in the very first chapter we hear Moses saying, "You rebelled against the command of Yahweh your God, which was to enter into the land as commanded." And we see the same violation here. So they were afraid to enter into the land, and they didn't listen to Yahweh and different places in the land. So that's considered rebellion. Then later in the first chapter, they're described as rebelled against the command of Yahweh and presumptively went up into the hill country, which is to say they did not wait to see if Yahweh approved of their going to war in that situation. So they entered into battle without Yahweh's support. A little later in Deuteronomy, we see a similar one about refusing to enter the land. That comes right after a recitation of the golden calf incident, and again, described in a long-term way. You have been rebellious against Yahweh from the day you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place. And we see the same thing at the very end of Deuteronomy, the summary in Moses' voice here. "For I know well how rebellious and stubborn you are. If you already have been so rebellious toward Yahweh while I am still alive among you, how much more after my death?" And perhaps that's what's in Samuel's mind here, or at least in the author's mind, because there are many aspects of this section which seem more Deuteronomistic, in the sense they're coming more from the perspective of the larger picture from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings than some of the specific story of Saul and David, as we'll see, which seem more specifically connected to the events of their time. And so that raises the question of whether Samuel's speech here is meant to be a summary from the overall authors and editors of the Deuteronomistic history about the entire sequence of monarchy, or whether it's simply the character Samuel in this context, whose views are not necessarily the same. We've seen Samuel has a lot of self-interest, but perhaps the authors of Deuteronomistic history had their own self-interest, and it's hard to separate those out. So we have, for the first time, this issue of rebelling. But it's rebelling against the command of Yahweh. And no specific command is made here. and it's said again here, positively and negatively. If you don't rebel, it will be well, although the Hebrew doesn't have an ending there. It just leaves it as a blank pause. And I noted the issue of follow here, so I'll go back to that. It's literally on after from the verb chai there earlier in the verse, which is the verb for to be. So if you will be after Yahweh in that sense. But it just pauses there. But if you will not listen to the Yahweh's voice and rebel, then the hand of Yahweh will be against you. And the hand of the Lord, the hand of Yahweh is certainly part of that there. Contrasting with Samuel's claim earlier that he had not found anything in his hand. That was a sense of a royal prerogative to take from the people and have it in your hand, wealth or other things. So the hand of Yahweh will be against you while Samuel's hands are clean. So with that in mind, he repeats this, take your stand. I recall that last time we see this, take your stand here is echoing the take your stand up here that we already saw in verse 6 and 7. So twice they're told to take their stand, which is a technical legal term here to express that they're being put on trial before the court of Yahweh. But that's not exactly what happens. When he says to take their stand, he says, see this great thing, literally the great word, that Yahweh will do, literally make, before your eyes. And we might not think of it as a word because Yahweh's not going to say anything, but in that sense, everything that Yahweh does is done through Yahweh's word. From one perspective, Yahweh also does things through Yahweh's hands, etc. Obviously all metaphorical. So I'll move down the screen so we can see the next part. Then something really shocking comes. After seeming like he's going to do some theology, Samuel jumps into more like Elijah mode. And whether the authors of this story know Elijah, who's only a character, later in the monarchy, again, is one of those source questions. If this is somebody writing later who knows that tradition, for certainly Elijah was known to call down storms or to prevent the sky from raining. But here Samuel does this against his own people. So let's look at this verse and see this terrible threat he makes, which Yahweh follows up on. Is it not the wheat harvest today? And that would make it like what we call late spring, May and June, not the usual rainy season. Israel's weather being much like Southern California, where it's rainy in the fall and the winter, and then you rely on holding on to that water to keep your harvest when the sun comes out and warms up the earth for growth. So the wheat harvest would be one of their main harvests, and what he threatens to do is destroy it as an expression that God is on his side. Now, Yahweh's not been a part of this, and Yahweh doesn't say a word through this, but Yahweh responds. So let's see the detail of this. I will call upon Yahweh, he may send thunder and rain out of season, and you shall know and see the evil or the wickedness that you have done in the sight of Yahweh is great in demanding a king for yourself. So the evil is named specifically as demanding a king. That phrase, see the wickedness you have done, is echoing from Judges, and it'll echo again in 2 Samuel, which is the Bathsheba and Uriah situation. But the evil that people have done in the sight of the Lord is a common phrase in Judges. This exact phrase is only there, but as common is often for worshiping other gods, the Baals and Astartes, as Samuel already named as an issue along the way. But what exactly is it here? It's asking for a king. But how would they know that was evil? There's certainly no law about it. They obviously knew they weren't supposed to worship other gods, but how do they know they weren't supposed to ask for a king? The only reason would be Deuteronomy 17, and Deuteronomy 17 is not in sight here. Samuel's certainly not calling on those terms as an expression of what right relationship between God, the people, and a king would be. So it's specifically in demanding a king, or literally asking, Sauling for a king. Leshial here, one of the many wordplays, since the Hebrew word to ask is Saul, Shaul. So they Sauled for a king, and they got one. And so Samuel's speech is broken up here by the narrator's interruption for just one verse here in verse 18. So Samuel called upon Yahweh, and Yahweh sent thunder and rain. In other words, Yahweh is being obedient to Samuel, listening to Samuel's voice. And not surprisingly, all the people greatly feared Yahweh and Samuel, which is probably the point here, to have them fear Samuel. But Yahweh is plainly backing this up and destroying their wheat harvest. We don't hear the outcome of it. We don't hear how long it rained, if the harvest is totally destroyed or not. But certainly for a farming people dependent upon their own agriculture, to have sudden storm on their harvest would be the worst possible outcome. It'd make you wonder, is Yahweh on your side or not? And yet it happens. So not surprisingly then, the people respond and they speak up for the first time here. And as my note has here, they're like obedient children, but obeying their father Samuel will not teach them a lesson over the long haul. It'll only be exile, since it's only exile that will teach them that monarchy was ultimately a failed proposition. So all the people said to Samuel, "Pray to Yahweh your God." Notice that not our God. This is a rare occasion where the Israelites would disclaim that Yahweh is their God. Pray to Yahweh your God for your servants, speaking of themselves in the third person, so we may not die, for we have added to all our sins the evil of demanding a king. And that added is also echoing the scene from Judges. This is the first time they're confessing that they've committed sins at all. And it's only the second time we've seen the noun for sin in the book of Samuel. You'll see it earlier here. We'll see a couple of these others coming up, and it'll be, as my note has, it's curious what is and what isn't called a sin in Samuel. But now they're acknowledging from themselves that it's the sin, to adding their sins, the evil of demanding a king. So they're saying it's not only just a sin, but it's evil to demand a king. And yet they don't say, take the kingship away from us, or we won't do it, or we'll reject our king. They simply acknowledge it. And so it's Samuel's turn to respond. Now they've confessed their sin, now what? And we should keep in mind, is confessing your sin to the prophet or the judge what you're supposed to be doing here? Who would they be confessing to? Normally it would be a priest, not in the Catholic sense of a sacrament of confession, but as often is in the Torah, of acknowledging what one has done so that one can know what the proper sacrifice is to offer. Not so much that the priest offers some kind of immediate absolution, but offers a way to be right with God. So Samuel offers this, said to the people, "Do not be afraid." And again, the contrast we've seen with be afraid and don't be afraid. You have done all this evil, so everybody's agreed now, Samuel and the people, that they've asked for a king and it's evil. But, he says, do not turn aside from following Yahweh, but serve Yahweh with all your heart. Which, if your mind's not spinning like mine is, I wonder if theirs are. Because what can it mean to follow Yahweh with a king, if asking for a king was rebellion and sin and evil? The word for turn aside here, swar, here in this form of saru, as many times, it's a Deuteronomistic word. Almost half the uses in the Masoretic text are in the Deuteronomistic history from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. Mostly for turning away from worshiping other gods. In fact, it's exactly what one would do when one has done something wrong. If one is worshiping the Baals and Astartes, the right response would be turn aside from worshiping them and turn to Yahweh. But here it's do not turn aside from following Yahweh, and do not turn aside from useless things. There's I'm not do not turn aside after. It's confusing, is it? Do not turn aside after. So not turn away from God toward useless things, but not about other gods, which they've not been alleged to have done. And what would these useless things be? What is it that they've done so far that would lead Samuel to say that they need to not turn aside after useless things? Hatohu, from the verb, from the noun rather, tohu, meaning something like chaos. It's as we see in Genesis 1:2. Everything was tohu vabohu when God acted to turn it into something in an ordered form of water and land and separate places, etc. So whatever these tohu are that cannot save and repeated that they are tohu isn't clear, because the only thing they've gone after is a king. And this seems to suggest something more than a king. Again, part of how confusing Samuel's words are to them. And so they're not told to turn aside from their king. And yet, how can they be faithful to Yahweh if they have a king? So let's look at the end here before we just leave our heads wondering how can one be faithful under Samuel's leadership here. Samuel now in my note highlights the point. Let's look at the verse first and we'll see. For Yahweh will not cast away his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased Yahweh to make you a people for himself. The phrase great namesake is only one other time, and it'll be David's great namesake in the Deuteronomistic history, so a rare use of it there. Pleased is not a good translation here of yil. The Hebrew is willing, and as Rochelle Gilmore notes, it has little or no sentimental content. It suggests a volitional decision to take a course of action. In other words, Yahweh has chosen to make the Israelites a people for God's own self. It's not an expression of pleasing or displeasing there. And then finally, or penultimately, Samuel goes back to himself, which isn't clear why. Moreover, as for me, since he's been mostly focusing rightly on Yahweh's relationship with the people, and in parentheses their king, why does he need to bring himself back into it? but he does. So, moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against Yahweh by ceasing to pray for you. Notice the negative and positive stuff that makes this very confusing. He won't sin by failing to cease praying. Did I say that right? I might have even said that wrong. Or notice how he could have just said it positively. I will pray for you to Yahweh. But instead he has this double negative. He won't sin against Yahweh by not praying for them. How it would be a sin to not pray for them isn't clear. Is everybody supposed to pray for everybody? Where's that written down? Is it something about Samuel in particular that she'd lead him to pray for them? Where's that written down? So again, it seems like he's making this up off the top of his head. And then he says, I will instruct you in the good and right way. And the word for instruct here, yara, is in Deuteronomy, is only for priests and judges. Let's just look at that briefly, because Deuteronomy 17 is very close to the section around the giving of rules for a king. So here we have it. Carry out exactly the decision that they announce you, which is to say the priests, from the place that the Lord will choose, diligently observing everything they instruct you, which we see just right up above here is the Levitical priest and the judge who was in office in those days. So priest and judge there, and only priests in 24:8, the only other uses of instruction in Deuteronomy. In the good and right way here, or as Sumara helps us to hear, as an objective genitive relationship in the Hebrew, the way to the good and right thing. So Samuel's insisting that he continues to carry the power to instruct them, even though it's not clear what role he has in the monarchy. And the only one he's really going to instruct after this is Saul. So almost to the end, doesn't it seem like he's been going on a long time? Only fear Yahweh and serve him. How many times have we heard that? Echoing what we heard at the beginning, so framing this part of the speech. For consider what great things he has done for you. Whether those are simply the things that he named earlier in the verses 6 to 11, or something else they're supposed to keep in mind, we don't know. As my note down here suggests, it is possible that Samuel is referring to the recount of God's actions for Israel in 12:8 to 12. However, to make great, Hagadol, is not necessarily a positive thing, and the most recent thing that Israel has seen is the sign against the wheat harvest, that great thing that Samuel said they would see. So, and finally he concludes here, but if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. And as Borgen notes, immediately we find the new king doing wrong and being swept away by God. One may wonder why this sweeping away, this dismissal is so peremptory. But the prior glimpses of Saul's hesitancy and fear shed some light on this question. And a second, quite similar instance of wrongdoing apparently seals the case against Saul. So that's setting up what we'll see that follows here. But notice that the conclusion is both you and your king. So the fate of them together, this is certainly suggesting finally a monarchical or a exilic perspective on the monarchy here. Answering the question I've been rhetorically asking throughout this video of when is this voice coming from. So it certainly seems here that this is an exilic voice saying that they have done wickedly, so they and their king will be swept away. The people will go down with the monarchy. But meanwhile, Saul has to reign. And if you were Saul, how would you take up the reins, so to speak, at this point, given Samuel's speech? It's a difficult situation Saul's been put in, and it won't surprise anybody that he fumbles in doing it. We'll see how that happens next time. See you then. Bye-bye.